So, Christopher, just who was Edgar Mitchell, and, why should we really care about him or remember him?
Edgar Mitchell was the sixth man to walk on the moon. And of course, so few people have ever walked on the moon, so few humans, only 12 in total, that is reason alone to reflect on his recent death. But Edgar was also a kind of astronaut apart, I think, from many of the other moonwalkers, simply because of his background. He'd grown up in Roswell. He studied at MIT. He was a real intellectual, the background in quantum physics, and an interest, I guess, in exploring things that many other scientists were shunning away from at the time. So, for example, extrasensory perception was of interest to him. And in the years after Apollo, he founded an organization that was interested in studying consciousness, which was way ahead of its time as well.
Let's just get back then to, because I've got a note here that says himself and Alan Shepard, these, helped to kind of recover Apollo 13's successful failure. Now, can you just explain how they did that?
Yes, well, of course, it's easy to forget, actually, that Alan Shepard and Edgar Mitchell and Stu Roosa, the third, the command module pilot, the third astronaut on Apollo 14, they'd originally been slated to fly on Apollo 13. That was their mission. It was decided quite late on by NASA that Alan Shepard just needed a bit more time for his training. And so they switched with the Apollo 14 crew, who became the Apollo 13 crew, and their training was accelerated. And the rest, of course, is history, in that Apollo 13 didn't go to plan. There was an explosion on the service module on the way to the moon, and the lives of the crew and the future of the Apollo program was thrown into jeopardy. And of course, any of us who've seen the Tom Hanks Apollo 13 film or are familiar with the story will know that, of course, Apollo 13 made it back against the odds and everyone survived. But for NASA to recover from that and to decide, instead of winding things down, to go back to the moon and to do it even more boldly with more science done and greater exploration, was very brave. And the Apollo 14 mission became that recovery mission for NASA. It was the first mission to go to the rocky kind of lunar highlands, if you like, and a geologically more interesting area than the previous two missions that had landed, Apollos 11 and 12, had done. And it was a bold field site. They were aiming to go to a place called Cone Crater. Cone Crater was an enormous impact crater, 700 miles, a blast 700 miles away from the Cone Crater site had thrown this huge blanket of debris that had been excavated deeply from within the moon. And the exciting thing for the geologists and the other scientists behind the mission was that they were potentially going to find really ancient lunar material there. But to do so would require them to travel further from the lunar module on foot than anyone had been before. And that also was going to pose challenges. And in fact, on their second spacewalk, their second EVA across the lunar surface, pulling, I would say, a rather cumbersome sort of wheeled science trolley, they got really lost, and they walked over a mile from the lunar module in search of the edge of Cone Crater, and in the end had to abandon their search for it, just returning within 75 feet of the edge of the crater. They got so close to it, but didn't know they were that close, and then walked the kind of over a mile back again.
Oh man.
And so those were all bold, brave things. They were all firsts that Apollo astronauts had never done before, and they did it magnificently and set the scene for these major J-class science missions that followed, Apollos 15 through to 17 with the lunar rover. So really, the stakes were quite high. If they'd really blown Apollo 14, then the future of Apollo would have probably been cancelled.
What I'm interested in, though, is, yes, he has done all that, but what you mentioned in your introduction to him, he wasn't your typical straight-laced astronaut. You know what I mean? He really did believe in kind of aliens and faith healers. That must have sat a little bit weird for everybody.
Yes, I think his fellow astronauts, who are all much more sort of straight-laced engineers and test pilots and and even other scientists, they found his, let's put it like this way, his open-mindedness quite disconcerting, I suppose. And he was apart from the others, as I said before. And I think the thing that made him kind of open-minded was that he and maintained a credibility, I think, which he still mostly managed to do, was that he had this strong science background. And I interviewed him just over 10 years ago now for my feature film In the Shadow of the Moon. And when I sat down with him to talk about some of that stuff, I mean, there were all sorts of stories around at the time of him believing in aliens. He'd grown up in a house in Roswell and was there as a teenager when it had been reported that aliens had landed there. And he did have these kind of quirky perspectives on the fact that we'd been visited. He was really sure about that. But at the same time, he was also collaborating, I remember, with Nobel Prize winning physicists. This was in the early 2000s. And I remember thinking, if he was a total kind of crackpot, as it were, these Nobel Prize winners wouldn't entertain his collaborations. And yet they did, because they felt that, he was worth his open-mindedness and his scientific approach to things and his scientific rigor through his studies at MIT were worth a collaboration with. So it's hard to pigeonhole him, because, you can't write him off as someone that just sort of did these ESP experiments, which we should talk about, actually, that he attempted on the way back from the moon. But that, he was just an open-minded man, more open-minded than any of the other astronauts, perhaps.
Well, go on, Chris. Tell us a little bit about these experiments.
Yeah, so he'd been persuaded by some medical doctors that he got to know in California that there was no reason why distance should make a difference to whether or not extrasensory perception or the ability to kind of communicate between minds that are separated by space couldn't happen. And what better way to experiment with ESP than across this gap between humans that had never been opened before, in that these people were traveling further during the course of the Apollo programs than any other human being had done from Earth in history. And so they took a series of cards with symbols on them away with them on the mission, and then back on Earth, I think in California, at set times of day, these doctors would settle down and try and open their minds up to the symbols and cards that Edgar was thinking about. And I think it was done vice versa as well. So they would try and transmit to each other the images on these cards, these symbols on these cards that the other was thinking about. And then they would make careful notes on the picture that entered their minds. And it's a pretty simple experiment in that respect. And you can tell statistically whether you've guessed right more often than chance. And so they did this, but there was a flaw in their experiment in that they got all their timings mixed up. And so those on the ground weren't thinking and opening their minds at the same time as Edgar was. And so in the end, it was all written up in a journal of psychology in 1971, this experiment, but it was shown when they analyzed the data to be strangely wrong. So by that, I mean that it wasn't wrong by chance. It was more wrong than it should have been, if you see what I mean. And they attributed that to being some evidence that somehow it was working, but it was by no means conclusive at all. Right. And actually, it's also forgotten that Edgar was sort of disappointed that he'd messed up the experiment a bit. And so he persuaded Charlie Duke on Apollo 16, a couple of missions later, to repeat the same experiment again. And Charlie was so exhausted by his 3 days on the moon that he fell asleep on the way back, and he failed to do it as well. So it's never been done.
Right. Oh, that's a great story. We've got all that about him, but he is regarded as one of the greats. I read somewhere that NASA Administrator Charles Bolden, he calls Mitchell one of the pioneers in the space exploration whose shoulders we now stand on. I mean, that's some mighty praise. Do you think that, Chris, is a good description of of Edgar Mitchell?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could say that of all the Apollo astronauts in a way, and because the thing that they were all doing extraordinarily, even extraordinarily all these decades on, was to leave the Earth behind, leave Earth orbit and reach out across this 250,000-mile void of space. And so for all of them, you know, they were all pioneers. And Edgar maybe more so a little bit because of this open-mindedness to other things. And as I mentioned before, you know, when he left NASA, which was in the early 80s, I think, he very quickly founded this Institute of Noetic Sciences, which was another pioneering thing. And the Institute's aim was to study consciousness. And consciousness in the sort of 70s and 80s, 60s even, was seen as not really a science. It was kind of on the borders of the spiritual, and it wasn't something that anyone really in the mainstream science community felt that science could contribute to. And, you know, decades on from that today, we've got all sorts of studies of consciousness that are multidisciplinary, that apply state-of-the-art knowledge of artificial intelligence and neuroscience and genetics and physics to the problems of appreciating what consciousness is. But Edgar was a pioneer in that, and he pushed that science decades before it was respectable.
He was part of this Apollo 14. Now, I heard somewhere as well that they had a little bit of kind of trouble actually getting to the surface of the moon. And this is where we hear the story that Shepard apparently called Mitchell Mr. Unflappable. So he must have had some kind of good standing there when his nerves were at the edge.
Yeah, I mean, their mission was not smooth technically at all. I mean, even as they set off for the moon from lunar orbit, and then there's this maneuver where the command and service module have to come off the top of the rocket, rotate 180 degrees, and then move back towards the top of the rocket where the lunar module, the lander, is stored, dock with it and extract it, pull it out, and then carry on to the moon. And they even had problems at that stage with the docking mechanism, and it took them almost 2 hours and 5 attempts to properly dock with it, which was daunting and stressful enough, because that would have aborted the mission completely if they weren't able to do that. And then, as you point out, when they got to the moon, there were problems with the radar and the guidance software on board, which was intermittently receiving false abort signals. And the problem with an abort signal meant that the computer automatically on board would activate the ascent engine, which would jettison the bottom of the lunar module and blast the top of it back up to an orbit where they could redock with the command module to come home. Now, that was all fine if they'd landed and done their exploration, but if that happened on the descent, that was also game over, and that they'd have lost their landing. And as I mentioned, it would probably have jeopardized the future moon landing missions. The remaining 3 might have been cancelled. So there was a lot riding on it. And these problems that they had, they only had a certain amount of time to fix them. And they were around the far side of the moon, out of radio contact, whilst NASA and Houston was working on a solution, which they then radioed back to the crew, to Alan and Edgar, as they emerged from the far side of the moon. And then they only had a few minutes to type in, without making any mistakes, these changes to the software and to the data that the computer was getting to allow their descent to progress. And, you know, this was years of preparation for this landing, which was hanging in the balance because of this problem. And as Alan describes, Edgar was totally unflappable in that he was trying to enter onto a rather kind of clunky, what was called the DISC-y kind of computer interface, this basic keyboard, nothing like the ones we have today. This new data to fix the problem, all very stressful, but one that Edgar maintained his cool during.
What a hero. And am I right in thinking as well, this was the mission where it's kind of anonymous now, where Alan Shepard was playing golf on the moon?
Well, yes, at the end of their second EVA, their second kind of excursion, as it were, the one where they got lost, actually, and frustratingly just missed reaching the edge of Cone Crater, they got back to the lunar module, and they just wanted to do a few things that were just sort of fun for them. And in fact, Edgar threw a javelin, a modified sort of one of the tools they've been using, which is very forgotten because it's overshadowed by the fact, as you say, that Alan Shepard hit a golf ball on the moon, which he'd sort of taken along in his personal possessions, and then got a club sort of that he'd modified out of another science tool that he could kind of adapt the end of, and made a golf swing. Of course, it was very difficult to do in those A7L pressure suits, and so I think from memory he's only got one hand on the golf stick, as it were, and he just kind of knocks this ball and then claimed it went miles and miles, which with enough energy, of course, in the lower lunar gravity, it might well have gone a record distance, but actually I don't think it went very far at all.
So it wasn't like a proper golf club. It was a kind of cobbled together golf club, was it? Kind of, yes. I mean, you couldn't justify the weight of taking a proper golf club with you. It was in a way bad enough taking the golf ball, but so he had this tool sort of adapted and practiced with it, I think, in his own time back on Earth to prove he could kind of do it. And then it was just something he wanted to do. And I think the thing is, all the people that went to the moon sort of did little personal things, actually. And Alan's golf stunt, if you like, kind of backfired in a way. I mean, it wasn't, I don't think, sanctioned by NASA before he left, and it was sort of a bit of a surprise when he did it, and everybody sort of chuckled at the time. But then people thought, hang on a minute, this has cost the country a fortune, and these people are just messing about on the moon. And of course, they hadn't been. They'd done 2 days of really rigorous science in this new area that humans had never explored. But this was only a few seconds out of 2 days on the moon, but it still captured the headlines, as you'd have expected, and did the Apollo program, no favors in a way. Although looking back, I think now, it's just seen as for what it was, which was an amusing few seconds. What's the story then, Chris, about Mitchell in regards to the 2011 when he got caught up in this legal battle with NASA over this plans to auction some sort of camera?
Yes, well, I mean, I think it wasn't uncommon for all the Apollo astronauts when they left the program. They just often had a few, mementos in bags, in boxes, in wardrobes and cupboards at home. And in fact, Neil Armstrong had a kind of purse with a cloth bag with various things in as well, which was only found, I think, last year actually. And then obviously returned. I think it was sent to the Smithsonian for curation. And I think so. Edgar had bits and pieces. In fact, when I was at his house, he had the joystick control from the lunar module, which he'd crawled back in and unscrewed, and they brought it back to the command module before the lunar module was jettisoned in lunar orbit, and they came home. And so he just had these bits and pieces, and I think nobody really minded. But then if it came to sort of selling them, and many of the Apollo astronauts, they weren't that well off, because unless you went and became a captain of industry afterwards and sat on the board of various sort of banks and things and got paid a fortune as some kind of figurehead, which Edgar and Charlie Duke and Alan Bean, they didn't really do that kind of thing. And Harrison Schmitt, of course, he went into politics instead. So they weren't wealthy people. And so suddenly, I think when the prospect of being able to sell some of these artifacts dawned, with the internet age and eBay and stuff, some of them were kind of tempted to do that because they needed the money, sadly. And so I think that's where that originated. But actually, technically, the stuff's all government property, and so you can't really be seen to be selling it. But collectors can buy Apollo flown hardware that's been changing hands over the years now, and I think those things have been relaxed a bit since 2011.
Have you got any final words on Edgar Mitchell then, Chris?
Well, I mean, I think my kind of fondest memory of Edgar, I suppose, was he was the first astronaut that I interviewed for Shadow of the Moon. And when I sat down with him, I prepared very carefully all these kind of notes, pages and pages of notes on him. I tried to memorize all sorts of facts about his life to talk about. And one of his first answers steered us straight into these aliens. And he was absolutely keen to tell me the story that of facts that he knew that about the fact we'd been visited. That was just his perspective on that. And you know, a good journalist would have said, "Oh, tell me more," and explored that a bit more. And instead, and I will regret this for the rest of my life, I said, "So Edgar, tell me about the Boy Scouts." And the reason I said that was because almost all the Apollo astronauts had been in the Scouts, and we were interested at the time in this kind of, what was it about the Scouts that made all these Boy Scouts go to the moon, you know? And I was thinking in my head, that's the line I've got to follow here. Forget the aliens.
Chris, honestly, it's been lovely just getting your thoughts. Like I say, you're one of the lucky ones that actually got to meet him as well. You know what I mean? And what a sad day for humanity, you know, with his passing a couple of weeks ago.
Yes, there is now no one left from Apollo 14 alive, and that's a great pity, of course.
Chris, listen, thank you so much again for coming on the Starship Sofa.
Oh, it's a great pleasure as always. Nice to be with you.
There you go. Thank you, Chris. I'll put a link on to Chris's site as well. And he just knows so much. And really, like, he's been interviewing these guys for a long time. And it, like you say, what Chris says there, it's poignant because there is none of them, you know, Apollo 14 guys left there now. And they kind of do that, man. They kind of just blast themselves off into space and just true heroes. You know what I mean? Just quite staggering, to be quite honest, what they achieved. And it was lovely to get like an insight into this one guy. And there's a quote from Edgar Mitchell, and I'll read it out here now because it just kind of, it sums up what they stood for. You develop an instant global consciousness, a people orientation, an intense dissatisfaction with the state of the world, and a compulsion to do something about it. From out there on the moon, international politics look so petty. You want to grab a politician by the scruff of the neck and drag him 250,000 miles out and say, "Look at that, you son of a bitch." I hope you enjoyed that show. Please think about subscribing. You will get the shows each and every time I release them. And why not check out the videos? Worst science fiction books I have ever picked. Oh, they're there. Check it out. And while you're on, subscribe to the newsletter. You get Starship Sofa's Volume 1 free. Fantastic writers in there. Just sign up for the newsletter and you'll get that.